What's going on, everybody? Welcome to the forum with Josh Cowan. I'm really excited today to have Ann Kim join me. Ann is a journalist, the executive director of the Common Sense Coalition, and co-editor of a new book called Betrayed. America Didn't Vote for This, which is a volume of different chapters, sort of making sense of and taking stock of where we are in the Trump administration and sort of how to move forward and think about this. Ann Kim, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh. Real pleasure.
Before we kind of get into some of the questions, just real quickly, kind of tell me a little bit about your own background professionally, kind of the background you're bringing to kind of the work we're about to talk about.
Sure. As you mentioned, journalist, lawyer. I worked on the Hill. I worked in a couple of DC think tanks. So I feel like and I've worked in the private sector. I was actually a corporate securities lawyer before I went on to, public policy. So I feel like I've had a little bit of a 360 view from the government side, from the public policy side, and from the media side. And all of these things have come into play in our writing this volume with my co-editor and contributors for the Common Sense Coalition.
So tell us a little bit about the book. So it's a provocative title, Betrayed, strong word. Who exactly does the book? Well, sort of what's the high level bird's eye view of the book to begin with, but then like who exactly does the book argue was betrayed? What's the claim about the bad outcome, something sort of more specific that voters were actively misled about maybe what we were getting here.
Sure. So the book it says on the cover, it's a damage assessment.
Yeah.
And what we are is a coalition of about, 45 policy experts, former government, former military, who all got together to put together not kind of, to put together a fact-based analysis of what Trump administration policies have done. And that's where we get to the concept of betrayal. And you did mention that it's a strong word. Yeah, it's a strong word. It's an emotional word. It's an evocative word. It's also a deliberate word. And I think it has different meanings for different audiences. For those who may have supported Trump in the past, it really could be kind of a personal betrayal. He did promise that he would bring down prices on day one. He also promised that he would not take the US into unnecessary wars. That promise has been broken too. I mean, for those who have had this very personal relationship, loyalty to Trump, it really may be a visceral reaction to them that does qualify as betrayal. For others, some of us who kind of knew what might be happening with the second Trump administration, the betrayal is a little bit different. It's about this administration's betrayal of the values and the foundational principles of our democracy. And we go into that with 12 chapters in our book. The rule of law, the collapse of civil discourse, an economy that's become unaffordable. There are a lot of things about which the things that we have counted on for generations have been eroded.
So the Common Sense Coalition, I want to ask you a little more about this in just a second, but
Sure.
just kind of again orienting us, level setting. Common Sense Coalition isn't a progressive outfit, centrist, pretty cross aisle project. How did you take this either as executive director or as editor of a book? How did you get people from different political traditions to sort of agree on what that betrayal, even looks like when maybe they disagree about what the promise was or should have been in the first place?
Sure, sure. Yeah, I mean, betrayal, I guess you could argue is in the eye of the beholder. As I mentioned, it means different things to different people. What we try to do in this book, though, is just to make the argument about the depth and the breadth of the destruction. And we have chosen to do so with facts. And we have synthesized these facts into an argument. I mentioned that we have footnotes, 643 footnotes. So this is not conjecture, it's not hyperbole, it's a fact-filled synthesis. And it's 12 chapters. We're not trying to do this like florid rhetorical exercise. We try to make it as accessible and readable as possible. And in that way, we're kind of inspired by the original Common Sense written by Thomas Paine, because that was a 47-page pamphlet that was really intended for regular people, to make the case against monarchy, to make the case that here's the stakes of a revolution. That's not what we're calling for in this case, but he laid out in a very accessible way the damage that's been done by the king at that time and the political stakes if regular people didn't act. And that was an inspiration for both the name of the coalition, but also for the argument that we try to make within the book.
So my own work in writing is mostly focused on the politics of schools, kids, families. I want to kind of take the argument and betrayed sort of in that direction for just a second. Your own previous book, Abandoned, was really about what happens when systems fail young people who've already fallen through the cracks. How does the damage in Betrayed in the new book, uh, how does it land on kids specifically? And whether that's schools, nutrition, health coverage, something else. I mean, there's been a lot of media attention on a few of these pieces, but just kind of at a high level, is any of this reversible? Like, how do you think about specifically the argument of betrayed kind of when we're talking about kids and families?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. My 2020 book, Abandoned, was about youth disconnection, right? It's about the 4.5 million, probably more now after the COVID pandemic, of young adults who are neither in school nor working and how they had been abandoned by the various government systems. They're supposed to be helping them, whether it's foster care, justice system, or education. With this book, Betrayed, if you read the introduction to the book, there is a reference to kids and grandkids. That was future generations were very much on the minds of all of us who contributed to this volume. And the argument in the book is not only that this Trump administration has just kind of wrecked our present, but they've really destroyed our future too. And to your point, I do think some of this could be irreversible because in the space of 16 months, this administration has managed to destroy uh, institutions and structures that have taken decades to build. And there are a few specific impacts, like right now, that are going to have, long-term implications for kids. For instance, I just saw, I think Kaiser KFF put out a stat the other day that more than 1.7 million low-income kids have lost Medicaid as a result of the various cutbacks that are taking place. I mean, these kids growing up without access to health care now are going to be suffering immense health, long-term health consequences as a result of not getting preventive care, not getting acute things taken care of, not getting vaccinations, you name it. So there's that. Department of Education, well, what's happened there. And then next month, we're going to be seeing huge changes in access to higher ed because of enormous changes in higher ed financing, right? So people who are getting nursing degrees can no longer finance their education if they can't afford to do so, thanks to the changes in the graduate loan programs. So yeah, that's going to have an enormous impact on careers, on economic mobility of future generations. We have a chapter on climate change. This administration has completely walked back prior administration's commitment to a clean energy future, allowing China to leap ahead. So not only are we putting climate at risk for future generations, but our ability to compete in the clean energy space as a result of that. And then kind of the big picture view is faith in government. Future generations have no reason at this point to believe what their government is telling them because there is active misinformation being pumped out by multiple agencies on multiple platforms. And a lot of what our government has done right now has been against the interests of children and the families. And it's going to be very, very, very hard to rebuild that trust. So, irreversible, possibly.
Where in the book did kind of the arguments of the authors you were assembling or the evidence they were putting forward, as much as we'd love to be policy experts in every space, we're not. So like what was most surprising to you, like in terms of like what maybe voters wanted, how it diverged most sharply from kind of what we actually got? Like where in some of the putting this book together were you most surprised?
Well, if you mean, where did the nation and voters get way more than they bargained for, it probably would have to be immigration enforcement. I mean, it really has been much more destructive than I think anyone would have predicted. The chapter lays out the contributors who put together that chapter lays out in very stark terms the actual hazards to public safety that have resulted as a result of these immigration crackdowns. And I think the scale of that is much more than anyone anticipated. And, nobody expected that US citizens would also be at risk of death. It's bad enough what's happening to people generally, but the level of violation of civil rights, human rights, the deaths and the injuries that are happening in detention centers, the economic impact also of the immigration enforcement surge is probably much uh, starker than anyone expected as well. There's a great Brookings report that just came out this week estimating that the United States has lost 688,000 jobs as a result of the 2025 immigration surge. Their analysis found that for every quote excess arrest, 13 jobs were affected. And so, I mean, it has been catastrophic.
You mentioned low income children a minute ago, and I know you've written in the past also about kind of how corporations profit off poverty. How does the new book or this, how does Betrayed kind of connect to the thread of poverty, of kind of corporate profit off of poverty? We're going to be having some conversations here about private equity coming up in the next couple of weeks. How does the book connect to that thread to the current moment? Like, is what we're seeing just more of that? Is there something structurally, almost, God forbid, strategically different in kind of how the feds are treating kind of the issue of poverty?
Yeah, there's definitely some commonality in themes. The book you're referring to is Poverty for Profit, and that really looked at the privatization of public services and how for-profit actors have really taken advantage of government programs that were intended to help the poor, but instead are profiting from themselves. And that is definitely happening today in real time. You can see it in a couple, and I'll just give you a couple instances. First of all, we've had this long-going privatization of criminal justice, private prisons. So who is running the immigration detention camps? Well, it's Geo Group, it's Core Civic, it's these companies that have been running private prisons for decades now. If you just look up Geo Group and look at their stock price, it has done like this. And that's because they're profiting from the 80 billion that's expected to be coming their way from the One Big Beautiful Bill and immigration enforcement. So these contractors are being hired at enormous expense, often without competitive bids, to carry out the administration's agenda. So that is one way in which there is this group of corporate middlemen. And another example of that is the Medicaid work reporting requirements. So there's been a lot of reporting lately actually about contractors who have been hired by the states to actually stand up the compliance regimes that will have to be in place for people to report their work effort in order to qualify for Medicaid. Now, I have to clarify that most working age people who are on Medicaid are working already. In fact, like Walmart, McDonald's, these employers have a huge numbers of people on their payrolls who get Medicaid because their wages are not high enough to qualify for any kinds of other kinds of insurance. They're working. These are the folks who are going to have to be logging every hour that they're working at Walmart in order to qualify. Who is going to be monitoring those benefits? The contractors that the states have brought in at enormous expense, and millions of people are going to lose their Medicaid rolls. And that's something that I talk about in Poverty for Profit too, like just a really human impact of having these companies in there administering programs, profiting from the programs, and taking advantage, triaging or arbitraging little inefficiencies in the programs to profit for themselves. And this hijacking of government to serve the profit interests of companies that make their living from government money is a huge theme of the Trump administration, right? I mean, you can count multiple ways every day covered in news of the ways in which the Trump administration has tipped the scales in favor of friends and allies and using the government as an instrument of corruption. Even small things like, repainting the reflecting pool in front of the monument. That was a no bid contract that cost way more than it's supposed to, and it looks bad too.
Last question. So, we can write about what went wrong, and I think we're still doing that and need to do it, and it's really, really important to document. But I do think a lot about this with my own readership and sort of the spaces when I'm out there talking about stuff like this. And the question isn't just what happened, but what do we do? And given the political environment, like what does meaningful accountability look like? What is the common sense in your group's name, just with respect to, y- you know, like what's available to us right now as a resource moving forward in terms of like what can we kind of do moving ahead to kind of learn from these lessons, but also kind of like what are the, I don't want to say low-hanging fruit, but like what are the kinds of things that really, really need to be kind of tightened up as a first order kind of condition to getting us out of this mess?
Yeah, that's a tough question. It's not an
Mhm.
easy question, you know. I think it really is up to each one of us, you and I, and anyone listening to this, to make common sense available as a resource to themselves, to their friends and family, and that's kind of the purpose of the book, to let's, take down the temperature, go back to facts. What we don't want to see, I think, is really dangerous is numbness, the apathy, a lot of people are in this, I just can't tune in right now kind of space, even as kind of democracy is crumbling before our, our eyes. And I, for one, worry that this kind of willful blindness is going to enable everything we hold dear as Americans slip away. But we have to drag ourselves back into a space where we can try to find common ground as well as common sense and rebuild the republic that we are in danger of losing, and to do so in as measured a way as possible, to reach out to those who may have been in a different space from us, um, take down the temperature a little bit, and try to rebuild those bridges that others out there are trying so hard to tear apart. And in terms of practical, things to do, the conversations have to happen, voting has to happen, civic engagement has to happen. And I think even volunteering within the community will happen, and rebuild some of that civic engagement that we've seen dissolve as a result of what's been happening over the last decade.
Here, here. Well, let's let that be the last word. Uh, Ann Kim is the co-editor of this new book, Betrayed America Didn't Vote for This, and executive director of the Common Sense Coalition. Let's check back in at some point, see how it's going.
Yeah, thank you so much, Josh.
Take care.
Take care.